is, and we're going to hear from Dr. Klump, that we're putting enough pollutants in the water that we may not, our future generations may not have the same opportunity that we had. And that to me is sad. As I look at my life, and I'm much closer to the end of it than I am to the beginning, unfortunately, you like to think about, okay, what difference could I make in the time that I have? And I would like to make the difference that we do our best to save the Bay of Green Bay for future generations. And why isn't that happening? Why are we allowing pollutants to get into the water? Well, it's primarily about the money, and it's not about the long-term money. It's about the short-term money, we need to do what we can to attempt to fight that. And so we look forward to all of you contributing in any way that you can. If you can make donations, terrific. If you can attend meetings, if you can speak about it, if you can become knowledgeable about the Bay, that's terrific. Okay, with that preview, now I gotta cheat. I'm gonna make our introduction. Dr. Val Klump joined the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee's Great Lakes program in 1980 and is a professor emeritus and former dean of the School of Freshwater Sciences. His research on nutrients and carbon are cycled in the lakes has taken him from the deepest soundings of Lake Superior and Michigan aboard a research submersible to the largest and oldest lake in the world. His research has highlighted the presence and dynamics of dead zones in the Bay of Green Bay, including the impact of climate change on their extent and duration. Professor Klump just has too many awards and lifetime achievements to list them all for you this evening. Suffice it to say, he is one of the foremost authorities on the Bay of Green Bay. Dr. Klump holds a Bachelor's of Science degree from Duke University. And get this, he has a law degree from Georgetown University and a PhD in marine science from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Let's give a warm Door County welcome to Dr. Val Klump.
Is this microphone working okay? Can you hear me in the back row? No, you can't. Hang on. How about this one? This is better. Okay. Jettison this one. Thank you for your patience while we figure this all out. I hope this continues. I'm on Zoom through the hotspot on my phone, which the battery was getting low, so it's plugged in. So hopefully we'll get through this. I'm going to start off with a picture which some of you may be familiar with. Let's see. Maybe I won't. There we go. This is a photograph of the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, which was taken, of course, was notoriously caught on fire. This photograph was taken in 1969. Wasn't the only time that river caught on fire, and wasn't the only river in the Great Lakes that caught on fire. But it made the cover of Time magazine, and it was one of those events, I think, which helped trigger the passage of the Clean Water Act. In 1972, the Bay of Lake Erie was declared dead, and as a result, the passage of the Clean Water Act did required the reduction of points, what's known as point source discharge that's coming out of municipal treatment plants, industries, paper mills, etc. And the goal for the Lake Erie system was a 60% reduction in the phosphorus input. The phosphorus is the primary nutrient which fuels algal production in freshwater systems, and particularly in the Great Lakes. And by the mid-'80s, they're successful. They actually met that target. And it resulted in what I call the Seuss effect. If you're familiar with the book, The Lorax, which is about environmental pollution, Dr. Seuss wrote it in that book. there was a line, they were talking about fish, they'll walk on their fins and get woefully weary in search of some water. And so Schneeri, I hear things are just as bad up in Lake Erie. Well, by the time, by the mid-80s, Lake Erie had recovered dramatically, and people objected to that. They wrote Dr. Seuss a letter, and as a result, result was very slow. He removed that line, so if you go to the library today, if we're not stuck on the screen. God. Sorry, I don't quite understand what the problem is.
I had to change on mine a couple of slides.
Yeah, but it's not changing on this screen. It's changing online. I've given a lot of talks, and I'm telling you, it never fails to have something go wrong. I wonder, they close this. I don't know.
Click on over here,
Yeah.
and I can sit
Let's see.
clicking for you if that would help. You don't have to change it on the screen.
No. Mm-mm.
I lost a connection somewhere.
Let me close this. Okay. Let me reopen that. Screen. It's getting there. Okay. Let's see how this goes. All right. This is Lake Erie today. So 30 years later, even though we saw one problem, we solved the point source problem. We did not solve the non-point source problem. Clean Water Act did a very good job of cleaning up point source discharges, but it largely ignored non-point source, which is the stuff that runs off city streets, farm fields, etc. And so now we have massive algal blooms in Lake Erie. This photograph here was taken in 2017, but things haven't changed very much. That little dot there is 1,000 footer. So you can see the size and the magnitude of these blooms. The organism which is responsible for this is a cyanobacteria, something called blue-green algae and microcystis. It produces a very strong nerve toxin, microcystin, one of the strongest toxins known. And of course, in 2014, it showed up in the Toledo, which derives its water, drinking water from Lake Erie, showed up in the Toledo water intake and shut down that water intake for 500,000 people for a period of about 3 days. Couldn't wash your hands in it, you couldn't feed it to your pets, hospitals couldn't sterilize instruments. I mean, it was a really major disaster. Closer to home, there's the same issues here in Green Bay. Green Bay is unique in that, although it only represents 7% of the surface area of the Lake Michigan system and less than 2% of its volume, it receives 1/3 of the total phosphorus load to the entire basin. most of that, probably 80% of that, comes out of the Fox River. As a result, Green Bay suffers practically every known environmental harm. I think of the 13 or 14 beneficial use impairments listed for areas of concern, Green Bay suffered from all but one of those. Of course, we've done a major cleanup with respect to PCBs in the system, spent over $1.3 billion to solve that PCB problem. And we've essentially solved the point source problem. But the problem we haven't dealt with yet adequately is the amount of sediments and nutrients that are coming off the landscape. This little graphic here, Bud Harris put together several years ago, indicates 25 truckloads of suspended sediments and soils enter the bay on a daily basis out of the Fox River. So that, by the way, if you have questions, don't feel free to interrupt me as I go along. So any lake, but particularly Green Bay, is simply a reflection of what happens on the watershed. So whatever we do on the land translates directly to the health of the bay. And we indeed have cyanobacterial blooms. The photographs were taken by a good friend of mine, Kevin Firmenich, and it's showing up not just in Lake Winnebago or in the Fox River, but as far north here at Bayshore Park, which is just off of Dykesville. And blue-green algae or cyanobacteria are showing up in a lot of places now, primarily because of nutrient runoff. It's usually generated by storms with warmer temperatures. Even Lake Superior, one of the most pristine lakes in the world, has signs of these cyanobacterial blooms in the near shore of Lake Superior. One of the consequences of this, of course, is the formation of dead zones, and I'll talk about this more a little bit later. It's made the news back when we first started looking at this problem. Well, even the Wall Street Journal ran an article, and Dan Egan did a very nice series of articles in the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. So what is it? Well, dead zone implies, in this case, no oxygen. So what's known is hypoxic zones. And typically hypoxia is designed anything below 2 milligrams per liter. So if you think what's saturated, what normally would be, the normal water would be anywhere from 8 to 10 milligrams per liter. So this is like about 20% of what would be the normal concentration. The result is, and also then there's also what? Which is 5 milligrams.
Well, that's my next thing. I'm going to go there and try it. That's my next step.
One of the reasons Green Bay has the issues it has, because of its morphology, it's a very efficient trap. So 70% at least of the phosphorus that comes into Green Bay stays in Green Bay. Sedimentation rates are high, organic carbon concentrations in the sediments. These are very organic rich sediments. Result is that when this organic material sediments out and begins to decompose, that decomposition process consumes oxygen, and that's what drives the oxygen levels in the water to low levels. And it can do it fairly quickly in a matter of days, 2 weeks, depending on the depth of the water and the depth of the concentration. This is a summertime phenomenon. And the reason it's a summertime phenomenon is because it only occurs under stratified conditions. So lakes in the summer, when the surface water warms up, warm water is lighter, it's less dense than cold water. As a result, you get a layer of warm surface water over cool bottom water. And once that cap is on there, that bottom water can no longer contact the atmosphere. So it can't gain any more oxygen from the atmosphere, which is its source, unless the water mixes. So if it stratifies and that stratification remains, a lot of the oxygen is in that bottom water has got to last until the lake cools down in the fall and turns over again. And Green Bay is an interesting system because it acts more like an estuary in a way. We get warm river water that flows in from the south and moves north, and that water is replaced by cool bottom water that flows out of Lake Michigan. So understanding Green Bay means you have to understand the dynamics of Lake Michigan And as this cool bottom water comes in, it flows south. The oxygen is slowly depleted until it gets down into the southern portion of the bay where you can get concentration to drop to actually zero. We do have some long-term data. There's the Great Lakes Observing System. You can go online and look at the data that's collected all over the Great Lakes as a system that's been in place for about 10 years. Green Bay Metropolitan Sewer District, however, now has been collecting data in the entrance lake buoy since the late 1980s. This is some of the data from the last.
Yeah, I got it up on the screen.
Shows you where that station is. And you can see the surface water oxygen concentration is in green, and the bottom water concentration is in orange. And you can see it goes to zero periodically. It'll remix, and then all of a sudden another pulse of oxygen water hits that sensor. Interesting, in the green line, you can see the daily cycle, right? You get production during the day, photosynthesis, oxygen goes up, you get respiration at night, oxygen goes down. It's a beautiful signal. You can actually calculate primary production from those numbers. And here's a compilation of the Green Bay new water data dating back to the 1980s. And it looks to us as if hypoxia, which is shown over on the right hand side here, it's actually increased in more recent years. We're seeing the duration of hypoxia, that is the time that we first see it in the bay to the last see it in the bay, has increased by about 10 days. The longest duration of hypoxia that we've ever seen from this sensor in the bay was in 2005. Just coincidentally, that was a year in which we had a major fish kill in the lower end of the bay. And it was almost 100 days long. So what do you do to try to figure out how you predict how this bay is going to behave? It's complicated because you have what's coming off the land, you have the hydrodynamics of the bay and how it mixes, how it exchanges with Lake Michigan, you have the whole biogeochemistry of phosphorus and nutrient uptake, and deposition of that material to the bottom, and it requires, you know, the sewing together of a variety of models. And on top of that, of course, climate is changing. The system is getting wetter, it's getting warmer. And these models are complicated. And Green Bay is unique in that it's because it's tied to Lake Michigan. Not only do you have to run models that depict what's going on in Green Bay, but you also have to run simultaneously the model for Lake Michigan itself. Interestingly enough, hydrodynamics,
Yeah, 14 hours a day.
they could not get Lake and Green Bay stratified cold enough in the bottom water. And eventually what they discovered was the Lake Michigan model was not generating cold enough bottom water to come into the bay. Once they changed the
Do they open this?
turbulence coefficient,
You don't want to.
in Lake
Michigan,
Lake
That would be
Michigan
fast.
stratified at a shallower depth and more cold water coming into the bay. And then they could simulate what was going on in Green Bay. So it's complicated. Try to understand what's going on. One simplification is to develop a model which is simply based on phosphorus. How much phosphorus is coming into the system? How much is taken up by the algae? What happens to the algae when it produces organic matter? How that organic matter is cycled to the bottom. And then you have a series of models. So we have, for example, we want to know what's coming off the watershed. And those are done using what's known as SWAP models, soil water assessment tools. It allows you to calculate based on landscape conditions, farming practices, et cetera, how much phosphorus, how much sediments are running off the land. And the model, and this work was done by Paul Baumgart and Kevin Furman at U of Green Bay. That then you take what the output of that watershed model and you put it into a hydrodynamic model. It tells you how stuff gets mixed in the bay. And then couple that to the biogeochemistry. So what happens to that phosphorus? How does it fix into organic matter? And eventually what we want to do is develop what's known as management assessment tools. In other words, where you can plug in various parameters and see how the system responds to changes. This is just give you an idea of the complexity of that model. This is a sort of a grid that you calculate the concentration, the flow, the current in every one of those little boxes, and at 20 depths in each one of those boxes. And here's sort of an output of these models are driven in this case by loadings from the Fox River on a daily basis. And that's a simulation now of chlorophyll concentrations. Now, how much phosphorus is getting into the system and where is it coming from? This is data from Dale Robertson, which he provided me just a couple of months ago, still provisional. Basically, the phosphorus loading here into Green Bay, this is from the lower Fox River. You can see in the purple dots, hadn't really changed much over the last 20 years. It's gone up and down, but it hasn't really changed much. The point source discharges are these little bars at the bottom. The pink area is the non-point. So you can see that non-point sources of phosphorus in the system are by far the largest input. Now there is a TMDL, a total maximum daily load target in the bay. That is what we want to do to reduce the phosphorus to levels we think will provide adequate water quality protection. That requires about a 40% reduction from that sort of average baseline. So that's not going to be that easy. So where is that coming from? Again, this is work by Paul and Kevin. I showed you, this is using swap models, and it shows what the phosphorus yield here, and these are units of kilograms per hectare, or it's approximately the same as pounds per acre of phosphorus. And you can see it's not coming, it's not uniformly distributed across the landscape. It's coming from, other, some hotspots in cases, especially in the lower bay. Plum Creek in an area, for example, is an area where very high phosphorus loading results from. One of the problems we face is that farmers are given what's known as a target phosphorus index, or the P index. The P index, which is an indication of how much loading there should be on the landscape, is 6 for Wisconsin. These numbers, as you can see, are 3 or less. And we know that in order to improve water quality, we're going to have to reduce these numbers significantly. I'll go into that. Of course, agriculture has changed dramatically. Brown County has one of the highest densities of dairy cows in the country. The average dairy cow produces, as much manure or sewage as 18 people. So if there are, 100,000 cows in Door County, that's equivalent to 1.8 million people of waste we have to deal with. About 60 to 80% of the phosphorus and nitrogen that's fed to cows is excreted. And as I mentioned, the soil phosphorus is probably 2 to 3 times higher to be. Of course, there's been a lot of press about confined feeding operations and a lot of concern. But to meet the target, the question is how we're going to do that. This is the DNR's a phosphorus abatement timeline. So starting about now and going out to 2050 to get to that target. Now, this is to reduce phosphorus in the system by 40 to 50%. As you can see, the biggest component reduction called for in the system is agriculture, 80%. 80%. That is not going to be easy. That's going to be very difficult to do with the way that we are doing agriculture today. In other words, we're going to have to be a fundamental change of how we farm. This is small work by Kevin and Paul. They looked at, okay, on average today, there's about 90% of the landscape is in what's conventional till, mobile plow, et cetera, the old way it's always been done. They said, well, what if we did more conservation tillage? No-till, conservation till. How much? So they can, instead of having 90%, we'll shift that down to only 10% conventional till, 50% reduced till, and 40% no-till. You can get about 11% reduction in the phosphorus load, 11%. If you add cover crops to that, you can up that to about 18%. It's only until you reduce soil phosphorus to what it was back in the 1970s that you can actually reduce the phosphorus input to the system. In other words, we have to take the amount of fertilizer, manure, whatever you put on the land has got to be only equal to what you take off in terms of crops. It's got to be a zero net balance in the system. And it probably has to be in somewhat of a negative balance in order to reduce soil phosphorus in the system. But with a P index of 6, we're never going to get there. So that's got to change. you also, by reducing phosphorus, and also put in reduced till and no till, you can get up to 30% or so. And if you add cover crops, you can get up to about 40%. But this is across the entire landscape now. So it's going to be a challenge for sure. How, if we do this, the question is, how will the bay respond? What will our models tell us? Well, there's some good news there. It looks as if, according to our models, that if we have a reduction of, say, 35 to 50% in the phosphorus load to the system, which is within the range of the target, that the amount of algal production will reduce will drop by 16 to maybe 30% or so. So the bay does respond, and it responds in a positive direction. This is just another example of how the bay would respond. In this case, I've highlighted the orange line, which is a 50% reduction in the load. And you can see that the bay with oxygen concentration.
It's kind of all screwed up.
And
Really?
chlorophyll concentration.
I mean, they had a hard time. I don't know that.
Getting started.
Right.
Yeah.
There's a
It
I'm
happens
on. They
sometimes.
got this. I'm muted, right?
might want to mute folks. Okay. What about climate? Well, this is on everybody's mind these days. A couple of years ago, people weren't paying too much attention, but now, I've been giving presentations about climate change for probably 20 years, and I said the same thing every time. The 10 hottest years have all been in the last 15, and that has kept marching forward. In fact, it's the 8 hottest years, the last 8 years, and 2023 is undoubtedly going to be the hottest year ever. We're on track to be the hottest year ever. And I think everybody understands that. In terms of long-term projections for Wisconsin, we're predicted to be both warmer and wetter. Predictions for Wisconsin mean that I think for the middle to the end of the century, we would see up to 2 weeks of daytime high temperatures of 100 degrees. Now, I've lived in Wisconsin a long time. I think I can't remember a day it would have hit 100. I don't know. If I live in Milwaukee, it was cooler by the lake, but even in Madison, I don't know that, we get those kinds of days. Much of the warming is at warmer nights, so minimum temperatures over 70 will increase, and 20 to 30% wetter conditions. And this is important. And this is just an example here in Green Bay. 4 of the 8 wettest years on record have occurred since 2010. And 2019 was an off the charts. I'm sure you remember, off the charts year with respect to, it was 25% above the highest high we'd ever seen in terms of precipitation amount. We were doing a project where we're trying to model the system using, and what you do when you model a system is you use climate years for which you have good data. And then you run those climate years, and then you put projections out into the future. Well, we're in the middle of this when 2019 hit, so we asked for an extension of this project, actually include 2019 because it was such an off-the-chart year. You can see there's 2019. This is discharge from the Fox River. There's the green is a sort of variability over time, all the records. 2012, which is another model year, was sort of an average year, but 2019 was definitely crazy. And in system, that's true of Green Bay, is true of all riverine systems, that loading is very event driven. And this was obviously a big event. The Fox River, this is again work by Kevin. And what he's shown is over 70% of the annual phosphorus load, and even more, over 80% of the total suspended sediment load in the bay occurs in those, in this case, 14 days in which it rains. So it's those events that are really important. So if we're going to try to make a resilient landscape, we've got to make a landscape that's resilient to those kinds of events. It's not a day like today that's a problem. It's a day like when it rains 2 inches. So what about climate? So we've done a little bit of modeling with respect to climate, and we've run 3 different scenarios. One, a sort of a cool projection for the end of the century, one a warm projection, and a wet projection, and one sort of in the middle. And it turns out, if you use the existing management condition, don't change anything in the landscape. We're going to do what we're doing today. And you just change the climate, make it warmer and wetter. What does that do to the phosphorus loading to the system? And in every case, it doesn't matter which model you use, doesn't matter which scenario you run, the phosphorus loading goes up in this system. So the practices we put in today are not going to be good enough for the future. Here's some work by one of Kevin's students, Alexis, basically looking at, they looked at what you could do with respect to different kinds of conservation tillage and how that would affect it, and how those conservation tillage practices, which actually reduce phosphorus, would have, how they would change under a changed climate. And you can see that actually the benefits that you would get from those practices is essentially erased by changing climate. What about hypoxia? The projections are that the growing season could be as much as 6 weeks longer. That's going to be a big change for agriculture. I mean, I have a cousin who farms in Michigan, and they toyed with the idea of, actually having 2 crops a year, which is pretty unusual for that area. You can do sort of the back of the envelope calculation, because we know what the consumption of oxygen is in the system. We can say, what if it looks like this? What if you extend that stratified period by another month or weeks? And as a result, you can see the projection here as you get much lower oxygen concentrations over a much more extensive area. As it turns out, the place that gets hit the worst is right off of Dykesville, which is where the site of that 2005 fish kill result. And as I said, on average, it's about 2 months that we have stratified period now. If you increase it to 3 months, you take it to basically those 2005 conditions. So I like to say, if there's a bloom today, there'll be a dead zone tomorrow, and we have a lot of data sort of back up. Okay. So what are we doing in Wisconsin with respect to agriculture? Well, there are some encouraging signs. I mean, there are good players out there. There's the Lower Fox demonstration farm network. They're doing exploring, working with some farmers to look at cover crops, to look at no-till, do a variety of things. The Nature Conservancy has a program where they're soliciting farmers to come up with new strategies. Here's one indication of a shift, which is in a positive direction. This is satellite data now that looks at cover crops. You can tell how much ground is covered or open from satellite data. And this is for the Apple Creek watershed. And this was done by Kevin again. And here you can see this is a scale from higher residue and cover, so it's a more resilient landscape, to basically very little cover. And you can see the changes here are over the years. So we'll just compare 2014, 2018. So there's 2014 and there's 2018. So basically, at least in this watershed, we are moving in the right direction. That's really good news. But we have a long way to go. What are the take-home messages up to this point? Well, a 40 to 50% reduction is needed to meet what we think are the targets necessary to protect water quality and reduce hypoxia in the bay. That's going to be hard to do. It really is going to be hard to do. Models indicate, however, the bay is responsive. If you do that, you will gain some benefit. So that's good news. Climate change may exacerbate the problem and offset gains from the development of best management practices. That's not good. but as a reality we are facing. And the real bottom line, I think, for this watershed that pointed out by Paul and Kevin, is that to achieve the TMDL targets, to achieve this 40% reduction, the only way we're going to be able to do that is if we reduce the soil test phosphorus on the landscape to a level that doesn't exceed what we need for crop production, crop requirements. You know, that's basically, Kevin is saying, roughly what existed in the 1970s. So in that respect, we have to turn back the clock. And that alone is not going to do it. You also have to reduce tillage and cover crops, other, conservation farming issues. Well, what can be done? There was a conference held in Madison back in February, a phosphorus conference, and they came out with a report. And one of the pieces of that report were some policy recommendations, and they were quite long. And I'm just going to summarize them very quickly here. But these are things that I think was by that group was determined things that we needed to move forward. First of all, improve phosphorus management strategies. Look at conservation practices in the landscape. Look at things like cover crops. Look at and for example, it's a promotion of implementation of cover crops is only 6% that's a statewide, and so we can do much better than that for sure. Reinvest in the land grant conservation initiative, provide advanced support for farmers. I mean, it's going to be hard to do this without some carrots, for example. I mean, my feeling is we'll have to have some sticks too, but we really have to. I mean, let's face it, farming is an essential industry. And what can you think of another thing which takes energy from the sun and basically grows something that's essential for everybody, which is food, right? So we depend heavily on agriculture, but we just need to do a much better job than we're doing today. One of the most successful programs that have been shown in various places is you really have to have the producers involved. I mean, this can't be a top-down kind of effort. You really have to get the producers, the operators together, along with people in the watershed, with the stakeholders that have the interest, and put those together. And when that happens, real progress has been made in some of these watersheds. But you have to support that activity. You have to support county agronomists, for example. The average agronomist can probably handle something that's about 20,000 acres. So you can actually divide how much landscape you have in agriculture by 20,000 and figure out, well, how many agronomists do we need in this area? And I can say we don't have nearly enough. And there's a whole variety of other things like water trading here in the Green Bay system. The sewage treatment of new water actually will take, instead of ratcheting down their point source discharge, which is very expensive, highly intense in terms of capital investment. Instead, they're taking that money and spending it in the watershed to improve the amount to reduce the amount of phosphorus that's coming out. It's a very cost-effective way to do it, and it's much beneficial to the system. For every pound that they would reduce from their output, from their discharge, they have to account for at least 1.5 pounds up in the watershed. Fix regulatory gaps and limitations, and there were a handful of these as well. Lower the Wisconsin phosphorus index on a watershed basis. This is, I think, the one take-home message that Kevin and Paul came through with is that is the key, actually, to reducing phosphorus loading in the system. Another recommendation was require all animal feeding operations to attain the WPDS permit. And I know this has been controversial. I know because I've read in the paper, there have been some words that some people in the agricultural industry are upset about this. Primarily, I think, because it takes so long. Well, there's a solution to that is you need to get more people who are responsible for issuing permits. We need to fund the DNR to do the job it needs to do. If we do that, then the farmers don't have to be waiting to get a permit. They also recommend reducing the K4 animal threshold from 1,000 to 300 I think that would be a pretty dramatic change. Yes, sir.
Is that to enable the PDS permits, or just in general put a cap on how many animal units you can have?
It's both, as I understand.
Okay.
So they're required to get a permit. Only CAFOs are required to get a permit, but they're suggesting, they're recommending that what qualifies you as having to get a permit would be if you have 300 animal units instead of 1,000, which it is now.
So that wouldn't prevent someone from continuing to add more and more animal units, though.
No.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And it has. Let's face it. And of course, you got to resource the DNR to be able to do this. And then going to expand education and outreach, and this means just not public education, but also education in the agricultural industry. How do you do this? It's not, it's not rocket science, but it is not simple either. And so we need to, increase, and we have great. Oh, it's red. Sorry. Select.
Battery.
Might have. Wait. How do you turn it on?
Here.
Is that it?
Like this. We'll change the battery real quick.
All right. So education, obviously. I was just watching a video earlier this morning. Farmer explaining no-till equipment, demonstrating it, and the stuff is complicated. I mean, there are about 10 different little gadgets you have to adjust. How much pressure, how deep you put the seed, how much pressure you put on, how much pressure you put it back in, how big the seed is. I mean, it's complicated, and this equipment is not cheap either. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. It's like a Formula One pit crew. Thanks. Ultimately, what we want to do is predict the future, right? Well, the only way you can predict the future is if you have a model of how the system works. And that model has to include all the basic processes that go in to driving that system. And that model is only going to be as good as the data that you can put into it. We need to collect the data to verify and calibrate and make sure these models are reasonably good and we can rely on predictions. And once you have those predictions, then it's up to the policymakers to decide, okay, if the system is going to change, it's going to look like this 20 years from now, what do we do now? And that's a problem because it's really hard to motivate people to do something today whose benefit will pay off in 20 years. I always have said that, with respect to things like PCB pollution, that if we had known that, PCBs were going to cause a problem and didn't use them, we would have saved billions of dollars for sure, billions of dollars. But the cost, the value of saving future dollars today is essentially zero. Now, if you develop an organism or a process which eliminates the problem, you'll make a lot of money, and that's valuable. But the problem is understanding, saving money in the future. One of the keys, of course, is data. Green Bay we're lucky in Green Bay because we have a pretty data-rich system. So long-term data is essential, and it's important so that we monitor the system so we can see how it changes. And you need to monitor it at a high enough resolution in time and space so that you can verify that your models are working. These are complicated systems. One of the things that we're involved in developing these little buoys, which are lower buoys, long-range, low-power, long-range radio signals. We're working with Cellcom, the local cell company, and they're putting receivers on their towers around the bay. And we're telemetering data. There's little antennas. So if you're out there in your boat and see it, don't run it over, please. Well, here's some data that I do. Maybe that pit crew again. Anyway, this is just so.
They could have been bad batteries. They were just in there. Hang on.
And here's data from, okay, great. Here's data from one of the buoys just collected in the last 2 weeks. So you can see, and this data is provided in real time. You can go online and get this. So bottom line, you know, the world we live in, more changes for sure is on the way. And climate's not the only thing that's changing. Obviously, it's going to get warmer, it's going to get wetter. Agriculture is changing. Plastics are a big issue in the Great Lakes. Estimated 22 million pounds of plastics enter the Great Lakes annually. I find that number mind-boggling. Half of that in Lake Michigan alone, 10 million pounds a year. I don't believe the number, but that doesn't matter. If it's a tenth of that, 2 million pounds a year, it's still, you know, an unconscionable number. There's something we can do about that. I just saw recently the Green Bay was listed as the #1 most livable place in the country. People are going to move to the Great Lakes. If you live in the Southwest of California, you can't even buy homeowner insurance because your house is going to burn down eventually. People are going to move to the Great Lakes. So the demographics of this area are going to change. And we're very fortunate. We have the world's largest supply of fresh water on the planet. 20% of the world's surface fresh water. We have a really good climate. We have a tremendous quality of life as a result, and it's going to generate jobs. We have a fantastic educational system in this area. We just need to put it all together. And it all depends on a healthy Great Lakes ecosystem. One of the things that's also coming up for Green Bay that some of you I know are aware of and are involved in it is the development of a national, it's going to be recognized as a national estuarine research reserve. This is a program within NOAA, where there are some 30 some of these reserves around the country. There are 2 in the Great Lakes. Green Bay will be the 3rd one. I think that's slated to happen in 2025. And one of the things that will happen as a result of that, one of the things that these reserves do is they monitor the system very closely. So that's going to be a real plus for Green Bay. Someone said that the major challenge that we face today is reconciling the inherent conflict between human activity and environmental sustainability. I think that's true. And it's even more true, I think, for freshwater systems than almost any other systems on the planet. So it's really a major challenge for us, but it's also an opportunity, you know, to demonstrate how you translate science and policy and law into improving the system and making it better for the future. And this is, I'm just going to do a quick plug for the School of Freshwater Sciences. Since I'm the retired dean, I feel still obligated to talk about it. Milwaukee's had a Great Lakes program for almost 60 years, but the school was just formed in 2010, built a new facility in 2014. At first, it was a graduate program only. We have over 150 graduates. There's Emily Tyner, who's at UW Green Bay, is in charge, by the way, of developing the NEARS program. She's one of our graduates. And last year, in 2021, I should say, we started an undergraduate program, so you now can get an undergraduate degree in freshwater science at the university. We also have a Center for Water Policy. That was the center which actually supported that phosphorus conference back in February. Melissa Scanlon, who was the founder of the Midwest Environmental Advocates, she's an attorney, is the lead of that. She's absolutely dynamite. You know, one of our heroes in that program is Dan Egan, which I'm sure many of you know. His family lives up here. He's a senior water policy fellow in the school. And of course, wrote The Death and Life of the Great Lakes, a fantastic book. I hope you've read it. If you haven't, you should get a copy and read it. But he's also come out with a new book, which is very relevant to our discussion, called The Devil's Element. It's all about phosphorus. And you know, a book about phosphorus, only Dan could make it a page turner. And it is a page turner. I'm serious. It's really terrific. He's just a fantastic writer and a great storyteller. So we're delighted to have him. I also should mention an initiative that was just in the paper. a couple of weeks ago. We're also in the process of developing a new research vessel. Our vessel, the Niske, terrific vessel, but it's 70 years old this year. And we're in the process of raising funds to develop a new research vessel that we built here in Wisconsin. It's being designed by Mark Puddle. Some of you may know Mark. He's located Seacraft Designs here in Sturgeon Bay. The other thing is the bottom. Restoration and protection of the environment and the system makes economic sense. And numerous economic studies, these are fairly old, but the bottom line is still the same. There is probably a 2 to 3-fold return on your investment for improving and protecting the system. When this work was done, it was estimated a $20 billion effort to restore the Great Lakes would return $50 to $80 billion in economic value back to the system. We're investing roughly $300 million a year in restoration. It's not enough. It simply is not enough. It's going to take too long. We need to set a target date. So we're going to restore the Great Lakes by, I don't care what the date is, but let's set a date. And to me, that does two things. One, it says it's on us to do it, right? I mean, we screwed this system up. It's on our generation to repair this system. And it also indicates what's it going to take. Don't tell me we can't afford to do it. The Great Lakes is the third largest economy in the world. It's a $6 trillion annual GDP. So to restore the Great Lakes is eminently affordable. We can do it. Someone said we don't inherit the environment from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. And I think this is absolutely the case. And when you think about that you're, all the deficit hawks, right? Let's not leave a deficit for our children, because somebody someday has got to clean up. Every human activity is subsidized by the environment, and we almost never pay that subsidy, and we got to get over that problem. This work was supported by a whole slew of different funding agencies over the years, and a whole host of colleagues. This isn't just my work, but I have colleagues and students who've been involved with it. I've been very lucky to be able to do this work. I'm not a Facebook person, but if you are, you'll earn me points if you go onto our Facebook page. I'm told by the office staff. So give us a shout out on Facebook. That'd be appreciated. So with that, I'm going to close. And thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Thanks for hanging in with the technical difficulties. Yes.
I have a question about that. The graph that you were showing where the phosphorus is, and it seemed to kind of stop at Chambers Island. If there was nothing done, have you done any projections as to if we don't do anything, or if we only do this much, how that could spread to the northern part of the bay?
So if you were to just have the river flowing into Green Bay, and you say, how long would it take to fill, and what's the residence time of water based on the river inflow? It's about 3.5 years. But the actual residence time of the water in Green Bay is less than 12 months. And that's because a lot of water sloshes in from Lake Michigan and flushes the system out. Once you get north of Chambers Island, it's pretty much Lake Michigan water. But there's a very steep gradient in water quality conditions. As we ratchet down nutrient loading to the system, that gradient will collapse. And so, but I've been on the Niske up off of, Fish Creek or at least Big Harbor, and seeing pretty high concentrations of algae in the water. It just depends on the year, it depends on the circulation, it depends on the winds, a lot of things. But yes, it's going to be a problem, but the problem in terms of water quality is focused more south of Sturgeon Bay, I would say.
The other thing that I was looking at was that one chart you had, the phosphorus levels, they were 2010 was kind of low, and then all of a sudden it jumped up and kind of stayed the same.
Yeah.
And then you were talking about climate change and how the climate's been changing about for the last 15 years. Is there a correlation between that? I mean, how does the higher atmosphere temperatures and all the more rain affect that?
You're very observed. There are some ups and downs in the phosphorus loading to the Fox River. there was a period in which the phosphorus concentration dropped pretty significantly. And then it came back up again. One thought was, and there's don't really have the data to back this up, but one of the thoughts is that Dale was telling me is that when they dredge, the remedial dredging to take PCBs out of the system, of course, they sedimented out and they ended up in these little catchments and pools in the Fox River all the way up to Little Lake Butte. When they dredged that out, they created a new hole, a new sink. And material coming down started to fill that back up again. And that may have reduced the concentration flowing out during that period where you're seeing a low reduction, but it has come back up now. So either that's not what's happening or that we've reached a new steady state where that the pool of those sinks have filled up again. But I mean, the take home message from that is, yeah, there's variability. It has to do with precipitation, it has to do with, you know, the climate, weather, et cetera. But basically over that 3-year period, the phosphorus loading really hasn't changed much. It's gone up and down, but it hasn't gone, there's not a trend saying it's going up, there's not a trend saying it up. And so we need to have a trend where it's going down. Yeah, sure.
Then I'll let someone else ask. So all this information is so good and it's great information for all of us to have, but what can we do just as like citizens? Like, is there, like, who is our target audience to be like writing letters or making phone calls and saying, we need to get on this, we need to do something?
I recommend reading that phosphorus conference report on the policy recommendations. There are, I just can't give you a few. There are a whole list of different policy regulations that you can contact your state legislatures, contact the governor's office, because they're the ones that are in control here. If we're going to change anything with respect to regulation, how we do it, that's how we're going to do it. We got to get, and there's momentum, and I think the farming community is willing if they see a pathway forward for them. I mean, ultimately, we probably have to pay a little bit more for food, but that's okay. We should, honestly, you know. We need to pay as a consumer to make sure that that practice that generates that food is not contaminating the environment. And that's what I say, every human activity is subsidized by environment. We never pay that subsidy. We need to figure out a way to pay that subsidy. Yeah. But that report is a good one to look at. Anybody else?
My name is Randy Kenny. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. I have lived my entire life on the Great Lakes, including Lake Erie in the 1970s, and I watched it go from very bad to a lot better. This is mid-Lake Erie, about a little bit north of Erie, Pennsylvania. Right now we live in a little harbor right up here on Green Bay, because I'm very interested. I've also read both of Dan Egan's books and certainly appreciate all the stuff you said about phosphorus. I agree, it's a huge problem that we've got to get our hands on. I also see the progress of the farmers seem to be making in what they're doing, what I can see in driving around. I also agree that modeling can be interesting in understanding systems, but I must caution, I've had some experience with modeling, and it's less useful for predictions. There's an awful lot of assumptions that have to be made before you can make a prediction from a model. And that goes for climate predictions and all the other predictions that we see. So that's all I can say to all of you. Enjoy it and take care of your phosphorus, but don't believe all the models.
Right. Yeah, they say all models are wrong. Some are useful, and that's true. You know, and what a model can often tell you is if something doesn't make sense, because that's why data is so important. You have a model that makes a prediction and it doesn't match up with the data, then you say, why? Why is that? What are we missing? Trying to understand what's going on in the system. Yeah.
It's like, you know, show me the man and I'll find you the crime. And when you're making a model, you know where you want it to go, and it's almost impossible not to bias the way you make the model.
Yep. Again, it harkens back to why it's so important to have data. Because then you take, if you have good data retrospectively, you can run that model retrospectively and say, how good was it for predicting 2012? And if it wasn't any good, because you know what 2012 looked like, then you know you got a problem. They are getting better. I will say this, that the climate change models, for example, are getting much better in terms of the resolution. We now do downscaling. It used to be that, you know, there was a cell which predicted climate. There would be like 5 or 6 cells in the whole Great Lakes region. Now these downscale models are, you know, regional. You can actually deal with a system like Green Bay. But the climate change modelers are telling you all the predictions they made 10 or 15 years ago are coming true. They are happening faster than they predicted. So these models did not anticipate how quickly the system is changing. So I mean, it would be nice if it was the other way around, but that's not the case. So yeah, I mean, we're kind of stuck, aren't we? I mean, we do want to know what the future brings. And the only way you can do that is if you have some sort of way of forecasting. And I don't use predictions. I rarely use the word forecast. I use the word projections. It's a projection of what the system might look like. We want to know what the variability about the mean is. And that's one of the things these models do. They don't give you an answer. They give you a suite of answers. This is the 90% probability. This is the 10% probability. We are somewhere in that range. What's that going to mean for us, you know, in the future? Yeah, but it's a very good point. You know, always look at a model with some skepticism.
Joelle, and I would just like to recommend a book to everyone here, The Great Lakes Water Wars. And there's a new edition, which I haven't read, but it's an excellent book and gives you a lot of the political background and also goes into Canada. It's a very, very interesting book, but an important book.
Yeah, it's by Peter Ann. Yeah, really good. You're right. It's a very good book, and you did come out with it.
And I would also like to invite people to consider joining the Great Lakes Book Club here in Door County. We meet from September through May on the first Thursday of every month around 10 or 10:30. I can't remember, but we meet at Right On. So if you're interested in the Great Lakes, that's another way to gather information. And it's a mixed group, both men and women. And a lot of times there's people that have sailed on the Great Lakes or worked on the Great Lakes. So I find that a very interesting book club.
Yeah. Speaking of books, I brought a couple of door prizes here. Has anybody got a birthday today or this week? Raise your hand. How about last week? In the back there? Oh, yeah? I won't ask you your age. I'm beyond that. Have you read Dan Egan's book, The Life and Death and the Life of the Great Lakes? Have you read it? Yes? No? Okay, here you go. This is your book. And I also got another. This is a book by another fellow at the school, says Siegel. This one is about drinking water. It's a little bit different topic. I don't have a copy of Dan Egan's other book. This one's called Trouble with Water. So, anybody else have a birthday, you know, recently? Okay, there you go. Yes, sir. This is another very readable book. One of the issues he talked about there is PFAS, which has gotten a lot of attention recently, as you know. And Green Bay is kind of ground zero for some of those problems. Yeah, Mark.
About the lakes as much as the Phragmites down in the Green Bay area. Nobody seems to be dealing with those. And I got a call about 3 or 4 years ago from the DNR. They called me up to see how we worked the program in Jacksonport. So I gave them everything I knew about the whole thing, which I set up there. But I don't see anything really happening down there. Can you speak to that? Because that ruins the water too.
Yeah. No, I can't. I do see, I mean, I'm on a bunch of email lists. I do get something from one of the Door County organizations that does talk about Phragmites eradication. It's another tough problem, you know. I mean, the problem with non-native and invasive species is once they grab a hold in the system, it's virtually impossible to get rid of. A great example is these dry-scented mussels. First zebra mussels came in the lake, and then in 2000s, quagga mussels came in. They have totally re-engineered Lake Michigan. It's a totally different lake than it was, 15, 20 years ago. So that what we knew about how the system functioned, 25 years ago, the science that we did then is a lot of it is no longer relevant because the system is so different today than it was then. And the ecologist hasn't been born who has a model who can tell us what the future is going to look like when it's dealing with those kinds of issues. So it's tough, yeah. Mark, and then the person in the back.
So you're talking about balancing the phosphorus that goes onto the land. So to me, that implies that right now we're putting too much on there to grow the crops. So why would someone put more phosphorus than they have to? And there's nobody that regulates that, or you know what I'm saying? Why is that happening now? Is that because they got to get rid of so much crap that they put on more than they need to on?
I was talking with my cousin, he's a row crop farmer in southeastern Michigan, and he said, back in the day, fertilizer was cheap, and so if a little is good, a lot's probably better. So they didn't really pay much attention. They put a lot on the field. He said now fertilizer is so expensive that they are careful as to how much they put on, and they only put on what the crop consultants tell them they need to support their crop. And not only that, they broadcast it over the whole field. He says just when he's spreading fertilizer, the fertilizer spreader will turn off over certain portions of the field because it's tied into GPS. They know that it doesn't need it, and that this acre here might need some there. They also spread it in a 6-inch path where they're going to plant. They can spread it in the fall, and the equipment is so accurate that when they plant in the spring, they can plant it exactly back in that 6 inches. So it's the economics of it. Now, when you're dealing with manure, it's a different situation. You don't have any choice about getting rid of it. And I suspect Brown County actually exports manure. There isn't enough land to support all the cows that are in the watershed to be able to spread that manure. So it has to be taken elsewhere. And it is, they truck it all over the place. Eventually, I think some farms are going to have to become, have their own sewage treatment systems. And they're going to have digesters. They're going to have to deal with that manure other than just putting it back on the field.
So the other thing in reading Dan Egan's book, seems to me that he says 60% of the corn that's planted does not go to food, right? It goes to biofuels. And that the economics of that isn't necessarily really cool either.
Yeah.
So there's lots to do.
Yeah, that's in the Maumee River watershed. That's right. 60% of the corn production goes into ethanol. Now, I've read where, some people are upset by full solar systems going in because they're taking farmland out of production. But producing electricity with solar panels is a lot more efficient than producing electricity or fuel with corn. So, I mean, you got to look at it both ways. But yeah, it's.
So my last thing is a little bit of a pitch. Dan Egan will present his book on October 16th for Planning at Crossroads.
Yeah.
So so if anybody's interested in that.
Oh, you should definitely go.
Right.
It's just a real.
You'll be there to sign books. And so on.
Yeah.
So
we'll
advertise that more.
Yeah. If you haven't read his first book, definitely. It's just a terrific book. There are a lot of great stories in there, and you will learn a lot about the system. And as I said, the phosphorus book is a real page turner. He had me looking up, the longest conveyor belt in the world is from a phosphorus mine in North Africa. And you can see it on Google Earth, but I know because I'm reading the book. Where is this? Yes.
This gentleman right here. I got two questions. One of them isn't phosphorus one of the things that people use to make their lawns pretty, if you will? I mean, it must be, I don't know how much of that on the peninsula, but that seems to me to be a problem.
Yes, it was a problem. But it's no longer. Now in Wisconsin, you can't buy lawn fertilizer with phosphorus in it anymore. So that's been banned. just like phosphates were banned in detergents back in the 70s. So we're slowly ratcheting down. And it's, I mean, we blame farmers, but everybody owns a piece of land. They have, my neighbor would run fertilizer spread right across the sidewalk. I'd say, Joe, I don't care how much fertilizer you put on the sidewalk, you will never grow grass there. And of course, when it rains, is why it's in the street down the storm sewer, which leads to the Milwaukee River and goes into Lake Michigan. So everybody's got a responsibility.
The other question I had is I didn't absorb quite the ice, like the bay freezing over and stuff like that. And I just heard the other day, and I don't even know if it's true because I haven't looked into it, but somebody said that Lake Superior is not freezing over and that the temperature of the water is increasing twice the temperature of the land around it.
That's right. So Lake Superior water temperature, that's right. Lake Superior water temperatures are increasing twice as fast as air temperature. And the main reason for that is because as it gets warmer, ice cover on the lake is decreasing. And when the lake is ice covered, the sunlight essentially bounces off and it can't absorb heat. But when that ice melts, the lake can absorb heat. And as that period gets longer, the ice-free period gets longer, it can absorb more and more heat. Now, eventually you'll reach a plateau, right? When there's no ice cover and sunshine is going to get as much heat into the lake as it can. So that's not going to continue to go up and up and up. The Lake Superior is a good case where we can see that strong final signal for sure. That's a good question.
Dr. Klump, you said that the School of Freshwater Sciences at UWM started in 2010 as a graduate program.
Yes.
So there is an undergraduate program
There
now?
is since 2021. We now have an undergraduate program. Yeah.
And I'm just wondering about the rate of applicants. Is there enthusiasm? Are you seeing enthusiasm for this major and this graduate study among young people?
Yeah, I mean, when we predicted, we thought we would have maybe 30, 40 students by now, or maybe 20 in the first year. And I think we exceeded that number. I don't know the actual number because I haven't talked to the admissions group, but I think we have at least 50 undergraduates. And so, and we also, in our graduate program, we have a professional science master's, which is a non-thesis degree. About half of our graduate students are in that program. 97% of our graduates are getting jobs in the field. There's a huge demand for talent in the water sector, whether it's in a regulatory agency or consulting firms or industry. Everybody's, water is important. Every aspect of human life is, controlled by water for sure. So our graduates are getting jobs and good jobs.
Dr. Klump, my name is Bill Holt, and I'm a member of DCEC. I have two questions and a comment. My first question is, as far as the Clean Water Act is concerned, Lake Erie benefited obviously tremendously from that. Unfortunately, it didn't cover agricultural runoff at all. How can that be changed, and what time frame can it be changed within?
Well, my feeling is, it's a good question. I don't have the answer for that. But my feeling is that eventually we have to do for non-point what we did for point, and that is say we have to put some regulations in place. But carrots are fine, but eventually you're going to have some sticks. I don't think we can rely on just the good actors in the watershed, to shoulder the burden of improving the system. Everybody's got to do it, and not everybody's going to do it unless, honestly, I think they're forced in some regard. But you can force them and pay them to do the right thing for sure. So I think ultimately that's the solution.
My second question, I also need help from somebody else in the audience, Mark Williams. CAFOs. CAFOs are a major cause of agricultural runoff. And it's almost a sham from the standpoint that much of what they produce isn't even needed. It's thrown away. We're producing something that is being subsidized and yet not being used. And second part of the CAFO situation is if they own 100 acres, they try to lease 400 more acres and get credit for that, and the density of the cows increases based upon leased land, and they're paying minimal rent to these adjacent landowners for that land. I guess my question is, based upon who they are and what they are, how do we control them to minimize their effect on the environment, especially when much of what they produce shouldn't even be produced?
Yeah. And those are
I
some of
don't
the,
know if you want to comment on that.
yeah, yeah. Well, you know, I don't think the DNR has ever turned down a permit for a CAFO. I think that there was this recent with one of the farms here in Southern Door County. I think they reduced the increase that they were requesting, but they didn't deny it. We need to be tougher on agriculture.
How do we do that?
I think that if you look at those policy recommendations, one of them is that they have to have a water quality district. I mean, you got to treat them no longer as just a farm. These are industrial strength utilities, and they are producing tremendous amount of waste. They don't have enough land in many cases to get rid of that. So it's you know, that we've exceeded the carrying capacity of the land. That's the problem.
They're basically being uncontrolled at this point in time. We have to do something about it. You know, I'll defer to Mark in a minute. My last comment on a question is that I can attest to what these phosphate runoffs do to human beings. I was dumb enough to get in my harbor. I own about 120 feet of land in Ephraim along the water. And the harbor that has been created there is nothing else but a cesspool. It collects everything from phosphates to foreign plants. And I had the stupidity, because somebody didn't show up to clear out my harbor, to go in there myself. I played dating myself, but I played Lloyd Bridges on Sea Hunt and just went in the water to get everything out of the water. I did. And then I was in bed for 4 days with a respiratory illness. So I can attest to the fact that it can do damage to more than plants, more than marine life, more than small animals. It can do a lot of damage to all of us in the room if we get too enmeshed in it. So I think I've read both of Dan Egan's books. I think he's right on the money with everything he said. And all I want to do at this point in time is probably focus with a couple of other gentlemen here on a part of what we're trying to go up against. And Mark, if you want to say anything.
Yeah. I mean, there are good actors in agriculture, and even CAFOs that are good actors. I know some of them. And so it can be done. You know, we can do this the right way. Yeah. Yes.
I'll just start with a quick question. What percentage of phosphorus did you say was coming from agriculture and contributing to the dead zone?
Yeah, it's about 50%.
Okay.
The total load is coming off agriculture.
Sure.
That's
So,
a pretty big system.
Sure. So I guess I think the challenge that we're running into right now is that I'm a farmer from I'm just south of Sturgeon Bay, and I think the challenge that we're running into right now is if the phosphorus load creating this issue, 50% of it is likely agriculture necessary. With that being said, if we have cover crops, that could potentially be a help. But the problem is, I think, number one, if you saturate on top of those cover crops with manure, it's negating any benefit that you're getting. Assuming that you're not adding any more phosphorus and you use cover crops, you'll reduce the load, but with climate change, you're also increasing it. So we're kind of at an impasse. And I think we need to understand, and I think a lot of these CAFOs are trying to come across and saying, well, we're using cover crops. From what we know now, that's not going to be enough. We need to reduce the phosphorus. And just so everyone knows, there's about the 4 leading CAFOs in our area. If you look at the difference of this is the DNR nutrient management plan that they have. From 2021 to 2026, we're about to see an increase of 100 million gallons of liquid manure in our area. And that's, by the way, you can look that up. It's public. It's the nutrient management plans for the 4 largest producers. So Yeah, completely agree. We've got some challenges. You know, I think we just need to look at, you know, I don't know if they're the saviors or good players if they do have cover crops, because again, I have neighbors who spread manure about 27,000 gallons per acre every single year, and it's just not enough to meet our problems for right now, and it's certainly not going to be that case in the future. So.
Well, I appreciate it. Here's the guy. This is the guy who's gonna help solve our problem. And the one, no, I'm serious, right? It's a young farmer who's progressive and understands the problem. He's gonna save us here. So, and he and, you know, his compatriots who are like-minded get together with, you know, and form these groups and say, okay, we can make a living. We love doing farming. My dad grew up on a farm. You know, this is important for our economy, but we can do it in a way in which we build resilience in the landscape and we really, you know, do it the right way. So congratulations, buddy.
I have one more question. If that's
Sure.
So
Last question.
Yep, we're dealing with, obviously our beaches right now are being closed down, like 4th of July, some of our major beaches, which is obviously a shame, and you want that for our kids and everything. I looked at the University of Buffalo, and one of their researchers, they were looking into increased algal blooms and how that creates kind of a more of like an environment where obviously the bacteria can thrive. Do you know anything? But that's essentially what they found. A lot of their bacteria levels were linked to the algae production.
The key there in understanding the problem is figuring out where it's coming from. We have one of the leading scientists in the country, maybe internationally, Sandra McClellan, at the School of Freshwater Sciences, who has developed the techniques where she can identify a source of the bacteria, so you can tell where an E. coli is coming from a dog or a cow or a seagull or a human, and she can do that source tracking. So when you have a beach is contaminated up here in Door County, the first thing you find out is where is it coming? Is it a human source? And that tells you, okay, that's the source of the problem. Now, is it a stormwater problem? Do we have leaky sewers? Do we have dysfunctional septic tanks, drainage fields? You know, what's the problem? If it's coming from seagulls, then maybe, you know, in Milwaukee, what they do is they have dogs that scare seagulls away. And in Bradford Beach, which was closed for years, all of a sudden now is a hot place to go. And everybody blamed the sewage treatment plant. And it's not the sewage treatment plant, it's the seagull. So anyway, yeah, so the technology exists to help understand that problem. And I know that the guys that are at Oshkosh, and Greg Kleinheinz, he's totally aware of that kind of technology. So more information, I'm sure, will be coming about that. Okay, thank you. You've been very patient. Thanks. I appreciate it.